Welcome back to my mini-documentary series about little-known or otherwise unusual locomotives or multiple units. It's been a hot minute since the previous episode, and today's subject is a narrow-gauge steam locomotive from the USA. Feel free to play a drinking game by taking a drink every time I say Colorado in this video, although I don't drink booze myself, and I can only hope you don't get alcohol poisoning. Right, let's proceed. The K-37 is a type of 282 Mikados steam locomotive from the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad. 10 examples of this design were built, 6 in 1928 and another 4 in 1930. They were built at the D&RGW's own Burnham shops, being the last of the railroad's K-series Mikados. The class was numbered from 490 to 499, and are unusual in that they are technically new builds, but they reused boilers and tenders from standard gauge C41 class 280s, originally built by Baldwin for the D&RGW around 1904. The locomotive's frame and wheels, on the other hand, were brand new. Their designation was quite simple. K referred to the K-series Mikados, and 37 referred to the locomotive's tractive effort of 37,100 pounds. The previous D&RGW 282s were the K-27, K-28 and K-36 classes, with the K-37s supplementing their older sisters. Speaking of the K-36, the idea to reuse standard gauge parts in the K-37 was done as a cheaper alternative to ordering more new-build K-36s from Baldwin. The K-37s ran on 3-foot gauge track, which was commonly used in the state of Colorado. Without the tenders, they weigh in at 83,420 kilograms, while measuring 12.5 metres long, 3.2 metres wide, and 4.1 metres tall. Bizarrely, the tenders had an observation hut, or doghouse as the Chief Destruction Officer of the ES&D called them in one of his videos. I think the idea was that one of the train crew could sit there and look back down the line, at his train. Given that these are narrow-gauge locomotives, it's hardly surprising that they have only 2 cylinders. These measure 508 by 610 millimeters, though I don't know which is the bore and which is the piston stroke. Unfortunately for the crew, these are not deckless locomotives. Since I first saw pictures of these things, I thought they looked too large for 3-foot gauge. Indeed, the boilers are so disproportionately large they could give the Lankshear K3 class a run for its money. However, the wheelbase was actually shorter than the K-36, and although they weren't as heavy, the K-37s were perceived to be harder on the track in their service days. In service, these locomotives could be found on most of the Rio Grande's narrow-gauge system, running out of Salida in Gunnison, Colorado, as well as the Monarch and Crested Butte branch lines. They also worked out of Alamosa, Colorado, from which they would run over Cumbres Pass to Chama, New Mexico. Historically, the K-37s did not run west of Gunnison or on the Silverton branch, the latter now being preserved as the Durango and Silverton narrow-gauge railroad, and upgraded to take the weight of a K-37. Although these engines were often used on freight trains, 3 of them were equipped with steam heat for passenger services like the San Juan Express. The trio included engines 491, 493 and 499. We'll take a brief detour from the K-37 story to talk about the Monarch branch, which opened in 1883. This line was 15 miles long and served a limestone quarry in Monarch, Colorado, with connections to the rest of the Rio Grande's narrow-gauge system at Poncha Junction. The line was notable for having a double switchback and grades as steep as 4.5% or around 1 in 22, which of course means 1 in a dumb Taylor Swift song, and the line was often worked by K-37s and other steamers. Loaded trains from the quarry would meet the standard gauge line in Salida, Colorado, where there was a crazy rotary dumper to transfer limestone from narrow to standard gauge wagons. Or, in the case of the Thomas episode Middle Engine, to transfer a green 040 saddle tank from a normal day shunting at the yard to an unpleasant scolding from the Fat Controller. The narrow gauge line from Salida to Gunnison was closed in the early 1950s, which eventually led to the Monarch branch being converted to standard gauge in 1956 and taken over by diesel locomotives. The old steam locomotives, such as this K-36, were moved back to Alamosa when the branch was rebuilt. After the gauge conversion, the D&RGW ran 4-axle diesel locomotives on the Monarch branch, such as the classic EMD GP30s. Apparently SD9s were tested on the branch as well, but these larger 6-axle engines couldn't handle the tight curves. Diesels assigned to this branch needed to be equipped with dynamic brakes to cope with the steep grades. In the early 1980s, Colorado Fuel and Iron closed their blast furnaces in Pueblo, which resulted in the closure of the mines up at Monarch. With no other reason to stay open, the branch closed in 1982, the same year that Dire Straits released their banger Love Over Gold album, and the rails were removed soon after. That tangent was overly long, so let's get back to the K-37s. Starting in the early 1950s, the D&RGW began to scale back its narrow gauge operations, but the K-37s kept going in regular service after their return to Alamosa, Colorado. But by the late 1960s, when the Rio Grande abandoned the last of their narrow gauge lines, not all of these engines were still in service. Due to a crack in the crown sheet, 496 was taken out of service in 1954. Now I don't remember too much about how steam locomotives work, but I know that the crown sheet is a major component in the firebox. 496 was the first K-37 to be withdrawn, and by the end of 1955 she had been scrapped. Of course, she is not to be confused with Kiwi Rail's train 496, one of 8 daily freight trains operated between Mount Maunganui and Kinleith. .490 was retired in 1962, eventually giving up her smokebox to 492, which struck a large rock near Navajo, New Mexico in August 1963. By 1965, what remained of 490 was stored out in the open in Alamosa, while classmates 494 and Peaches sat out of service in nearby sidings. Besides 490 and 496, the remaining K-37s had all been retired by the end of the 1960s, due to the Rio Grande ending steam operations on the narrow gauge, with 8 examples getting saved for preservation. The survivors are either in working order, storage, or on static display. Perhaps the most well-known survivor is number 491, thanks to Hyce showing her off on several of his videos. She was withdrawn in 1967 and sat on the rotten row in Alamosa for many years. Fortunately, the D&RGW donated her to the Colorado Historical Society, now called History Colorado, in 1979, and 6 years later she was moved to the town of Golden, not too far west of Denver, and put on display at the Colorado Railroad Museum. In 2013, ownership passed to the museum itself, and they set about restoring 491 to working order. This project was completed in August 2014, and since then she has been a staple of the museum's operational fleet, running on their tiny loop of track alongside Rio Grande Southern 460 No. 20. Quite bizarrely, at one point 491's firebox was used as a pizza oven by Hyce and his mates. One last thing about 491. When and where did the 3/4 of an idiot get the Peaches nickname? Is that a reference to the Stranglers or something? 497 was last overhauled by the D&RGW in 1967, and following a brief return to service she was stored serviceable outside the Durango Roundhouse. In 1981 she was acquired by the Durango and Silverton, eventually being restored to working order in 1984. 7 years later, in 1991, the D&S traded an engine with the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad, swapping 497 for K-36 No. 482, with the former continuing to run on the C&TS. She was taken out of service in 2002, and is now stored in Chama, New Mexico, waiting for an eventual overhaul. 492 was acquired by the Cumbres and Toltec in 1970, though the locomotive has never operated on that line, and is currently stored in Chama in an unrestored state, with most of her parts being removed in the early 2000s due to asbestos contamination. In early 2022, the CNTS announced that 492 and 497 were being evaluated to determine which one to restore to working order. 494 and 495 have a similar fate to 492, with the CNTS acquiring those two as well in 1970. Neither of them have been restored, and now they're on display on opposite sides of the yard in Antonito, Colorado. 493, 498, and 499 were initially acquired by the Durango and Silverton in 1981 alongside 497. After sitting in Silverton for almost 20 years, 493 was moved to Durango in 2016. Apparently, the plan was to have her restored at the Colorado Railroad Museum, but the D&RGW decided to do the job themselves. In January 2020, and following conversion to oil firing, 493 moved under her own power for the first time in 52 years. It was also the first time a K-37 had run on the Durango and Silverton since 497 left in the early 1990s. On the other hand, 498 was never restored, and now sits in a derelict state at the Durango Roundhouse, not far away from those weird F40NG locomotives, which were rebuilds of Tri-Rail F40 PHL-2s. As for 499, she has been cosmetically restored and is now on display at the Royal Gorge Park in Canyon City, at the top of a very high cliff above the Arkansas River. She has been there ever since 1999, when she was traded for K-36 number 486. And that was the history of the K-37 class 282s. I'd like to think I didn't overdo it with the Hyce references, and I hope you've enjoyed learning about these fascinating and comically oversized locomotives. As always, image credits and information sources can be found in the description, and feel free to check out the previous episodes in this series.